Synergy Practices podcast, powered by Arminco Inc. My name is Darwin Navarrete. Joining me is Sasha Nawakal and our team Safari. How you doing?
Me.
We're excited. Today, we got a lot going on. We're going to talk about one thing that has a lot going on with it, and that is a renovation type project, a facelift. We have all kinds of different requests, but it means the same thing. We want something new. We want a new look. We've got something going on. So, some of the reasons I think that even brings doctors to this situation is wanting some change. Whether it's they've had the same look for a while, or they want to add a chair to add revenue to the practice, or they want to streamline their process, the way that their flow is happening in their practice, from being able to the little things that we sometimes take for granted. And that is bringing a patient, walking in, that first impression when you walk in through those doors. What do you see? How welcoming is it? Now with COVID, is there that space? When you're checking that patient in, do they have that privacy? When you're checking that patient out, do they have that privacy to go over the consultation aspect of it? There's just so many pieces of this, gentlemen. Let's get to it.
Or it could be a doctor buying an existing practice and just wants to redo some of this stuff.
Put their touch on it.
Absolutely.
Exactly. And when you're talking something like that, you're talking a big time, possibly changing a lot more things than you maybe initially went into. And that's I think that's a common thing here in this type of scenario. So let's start with something basic, like a reception.
Well, I think, yes, let's definitely do that. I think it'd be smart to define remodel versus a facelift versus an expansion.
Okay.
So that when you're talking to your contractor or you're talking to your architect, you can kind of guide them in the direction you're looking for. Facelift being the most simple, just a quick definition of that. Facelift is anytime you're aesthetically upgrading an existing office. That means moving none to minimal walls and no plumbing, no electrical, no permits, no inspections, but you might be doing flooring, you might be doing paint, you might be changing fixtures and existing lighting locations. That would be considered a facelift. Would you guys agree, or?
Well, I mean, that's what I consider a facelift. Replacing on the floors, and wall covering on the walls, paint, ceiling, lighting, things like that. Things like you said, it's just cosmetic changes.
So staying on the focus of facelifts, when you mentioned reception. Usually when somebody comes to us and they mention reception, it's usually the reception desk, just making it look like I'm happy with my ops, I'm happy with the dentist, I'm happy with medical ops, I'm happy with my exam rooms, but I just want my waiting room to be more of a wow factor. In that case, I usually, in my mind, I'm thinking more facelift. I'm thinking, okay, what can I do to minimize shutdown?
Yeah, but as long as the reception desk, or whatever you're going to talk about, right, as long as it's staying where it is, because once you're relocating the reception desk, I mean, think about it, your bulkheads are also going to change, your ceiling design can also change, right? If the building is sprinklered, now you have sprinkler work. If there's a fire alarm on the wall, now you got to relocate the fire alarm. So at that point, it becomes almost a bigger renovation project. And I think that's what happens when we get calls from clients and we go out there. I think there's a big fine line. It's a fine line. There's a big difference between what a client considers a remodel versus a facelift, because to them, I've even had people look, I just want to build a closet, right? And they're like, well, it's 3 walls. Why is that a problem? The problem is if you work in a commercial building, sprinkler building, that closet needs to have a sprinkler, right? The closet needs a door, then it needs walls, then it needs to be touched up, then it needs to be, mudded, sanded, painted. So it's not as simple as just building a wall.
And the flooring and the ceiling.
Right. So that's the things that we go through. That's the part we need to define. And people don't understand that it's not. Sometimes a small thing can end up being a big thing.
So let me give you a real life scenario. And this is a lot of pieces in this puzzle. So I have a doctor that we're working with here, we worked with actually, that was interested in a simple facelift. But the facelift consisted of different pieces. The first initial one would be to give the overall practice a new look, new paint, new floor. There is a coffee station right now that's kind of used as a cart. They would like a built-in coffee station. The reception area is pretty nice, it's big, it's square so you can hit it in 3 different angles, but they would like a specific area in there with a little privacy built in some way, somehow, to go over the next steps for the patient. There are 7 operatories. 2 of those are used for hygiene, and 2 of those are unused. So there's need for being able to capitalize on the unused operatories, bring in new dental chairs. Every operatory on 2 walls on one open entrance, 2 walls on each side, and then there's a glass facing beautiful view for the patient. But this glass is directly, the sun is coming right beaming into the patient's face, the doctor. New ceiling it needs a new touch-up, so the grid, the lighting fixtures. So a simple call as a facelift has turned into all of the needs in one place. What would you recommend to this doctor with starting this process out?
Look, anytime I go, it's the same thing I go and recommend it to every doctor that I go to when I'm talking to them about remodels or facelift. Every doctor, any client that wants to do a facelift or a remodel, they dictate basically what their budget is. I always tell them, depending on, you tell me what it is that concerns you, but then you gotta tell me the budget. If you work it the other way around, we can make this a $200,000 project, or we can make this a $60,000. If your budget is only $60,000, $70,000, and you have this big of a problem, like large problems, right? Well, you're only going to accomplish something, right? And you got to leave it on experts to be able to direct you to the right direction and see which ones are priority to knock them out. Like everything you just mentioned about the sun being in the face and stuff like that. Those are things that you can come up with ways to, you don't have to do major construction to kind of keep that from happening, right? So, as an expert, as the designer that looks at it, we'll come up with ways to, keep that situation from happening. So it's more like identify your budget, what you can spend, and then identify your problems. Then talk to experts and see what they can provide and see what options they can provide. That's the best way to do it, Ramon.
Yeah, identify the budget and identify the order of importance. That's another thing. I heard you talking, I've been through it myself, when doctor's telling me, I want to do operatory, and I definitely want to do blinds. I'm like, let's not even worry about the blinds. Let's figure out the costs associated with, could be 20 grand to do a new operatory before you know it. So know your budget, but absolutely know what's important to you first and foremost. Things don't have to, remodels, ideally the most you can do at the same time, it's always cheaper, right? You don't have to shut down twice.
Right.
You don't have to go through the whole process of getting contracts and all that stuff. But it doesn't necessarily mean you have to do everything at the same time. You've got 50 grand, but you've got 100 grand of work to do the first 50 grand that's important to you. See some patients, bring in some cash.
But I will tell you, you've got to plan the whole 100 grand of work, right? You got to plan it, because if you don't plan it, you do half of it now and half of it later, now you're piecing it out. But if it's pre-planned, you know what the entire picture is going to look like. Now you want to do part of the picture. And you want to do the second part of the picture next year, right? If you plan it properly, that's good.
And this is very common. We deal with a lot of doctors that have projects that we take on in phase type projects.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And this is exactly what you're referring to.
Well, I've done a project actually in Baltimore. It was 6 phases.
Wow.
Yeah.
How long did that last?
What's that?
How long did that last?
It was close to a good 4-month project.
Okay.
And the reason it was 6 phases is because it had phases within the phase, right? So we had to first
build the wall.
Do one side, right? So that the doctor could use that side. And then we had to build a temporary side with a temporary reception, right? So that we can take away the reception and modify the reception. Then we had to go back and demo that reception area and turn that reception area into one of the operatories. So it was a face-to-face project, and that's what planning, I would say, planning is the most important thing. If you plan properly, you'll know your costs ahead of time, and you can time it properly. You shouldn't have a problem. Things do come up in construction, but again, if it's planned properly, you always have your option B, option C. You know if things do come up, how you're going to resolve it.
So let me ask you something about that specific project. So you phased it 6 times, you said.
6 phases. Yeah.
6 times, and the project took 4 months. Had you, what was the shutdown the doctor incurred versus the 4-month shutdown that it would have been?
In this particular project, the doctor had no shutdown. That's why
Wow.
we phased it 6 times.
That makes
But
sense.
I will tell you, you asked a good question, right? The reason doctor had no shutdown is because we worked over the weekend to do that 1-day shutdown just to relocate the compressor vacuum, right? And if you do over the weekend, then he wouldn't have to shut down because there was just a quick relocation of the compressor and the vacuum. But the important part is, in order to phase it, the space has to be practical to phase. You can't phase all projects, right? You gotta have multiple doors, you gotta have areas where you can block and where the doctor can use, while you're working. You gotta have the area has to be practical for phasing, right? You can't just phase every area. Right?
Well, we're talking about phasing and talking about something that I mentioned at the beginning. What if we have a doctor that wants to add a chair, has an operatory, but it's not ready?
Okay. Well,
Talk about that. Talk about the scenario that his lines doesn't have the lines. Wants a chair, has an op, wants a chair, but he's not plumbed.
Right. He's not plumbed. Oh, okay.
So then the question comes in, look, if you're on the first floor, when I mean by first floor, on ground floor,
Sure.
where you're not plumbed, you have to basically break the ground if you want to do it properly underground, right? So you can take your lines. So that involves a lot of dirt removing, pretty dusty work, right? Heavy work. And while you're there working, that could be problematic. While you're digging one area and you're still there doing, practicing dentistry, right? So then the question comes in, what area you're doing that at, right? Is it in the corner? Is it going to bother the doctor? Is it not going to bother the doctor? So you make a decision based on that, right? If you're on the top floor where you can core drill, it becomes a little bit easier because now you're core drilling and going below the space to run your plumbing lines, right? Or the other option is, can the lines go up to the ceiling and over? Depending on what it is, right? Depending on how high the ceiling is, depending on the strength of the suction, can it work? Can it not work? Those are things we identify. You can't just out of thin air just guess what it is. When we go on site, we look at this stuff. This is why we go on site.
That brings up a good point. There is no cost per operatory.
Right.
I know you get that question.
Not in a remodel.
Not in a remodel. Right. I get a lot of doctors say, Sasha, what's it going to cost me? I got to come. You nailed it. I'm not going to go through it all again. But you got to visit the space. You got to look at all the details. One might cost you $5,000. One might cost you $15,000. It just depends on this. There is no cost of an op.
Yeah. Just 2 weeks ago, we had a client that recently finished a space, and I guess they put the delivery lines, doctor delivery and everything on the 12 o'clock, but the space was not built properly. It was too narrow or too not deep enough, and he couldn't work because he works from the 12 o'clock position. So the chair was hitting the cabinet. So unfortunately, he had to redo it. And he was on the first floor. He was on the ground floor. And if we had to dig it from 12 o'clock just to take it to the toes of the chair so that he can have the proper lines on the chair. And he switched from a 12 o'clock delivery to a chair.
So what all this says in my mind is something that seems so simple sometimes isn't. First of all, having the right plan in place, having a strategy, having it planned out. If it is a phase project, being able to understand the timeline, understand every phase of it, understand what's going to happen, and just to something to keep in mind is simple of an idea as adding a chair sometimes may seem. There's so many complications that go on with that. As simple as maybe doing a small tweak at the reception, there's more things like walls, like code, the things that you need to take into consideration. We're talking about adding chair lines. We haven't even gotten into the compressor, the vacuum. You touched a little bit about it, but that in itself you need so much more power, and that can kind of change the operation and the practice altogether.
Like compressor vacuum, a lot of people when they're thinking changing, adding stuff, they're thinking construction, right? Like for example, I've had doctors, they want to add 2 more rooms, right? They're like, I want to convert these 2 consult rooms into a regular operatory. Okay, no problem. You end up doing that. Now the question comes, was the compressor vacuum big enough to handle 2 more operatories, or do they have to replace that, right? I've had people that, they go through it and they get frustrated, like, well, this is a new compressor, this is a new vacuum, but you can't handle the size, right? You have to upgrade it now, right? So these are things that, you want to pre-plan. You can't just go in there and do it. I always say, look, there's basically, few reasons, major reasons why people would renovate, or remodel. One is aesthetic, because you want it to be aesthetically pleasing. Number 2 is patient flow, so you can have the right flow. And number 3 is to add operatory for production purposes. If it's one of those 3, you gotta put it on the table, stop beating around the bushes, and understand which one you're doing it, and then get an expert out there, discuss it with them, see how they can accomplish whichever one you're trying to accomplish, and then go with it. If you try to piece it out, like, if I do this room, how much is gonna be? If I don't do this room, how much is gonna be? It's not the right way to do it. It's never gonna work.
And something else I want to talk about a little bit is equipment for our dentists and our orthodontists and our specialists. Darwin, I'm looking at you because I know you deal with this a lot. Just because your equipment specialist tells you you need a new vacuum does not mean the lines of that old dental office will suffice for the new piece of equipment. The piece of advice I'm trying to give to everyone is your dental equipment person is always just going to want to sell you that. They're not going to be looking under the grounds. They're not going to check the lines. Too often we run into situations where the doctors purchase the vacuum compressor and then we're the ones that have to do the bad news that say the main trunk line cannot support your new vacuum compressor.
I mean, size-wise.
Size.
We actually just went through that.
Yeah, you and I specifically went through a situation like that. And then of course the equipment rep saying, well,
Well, in this
particular
situation was an expansion, right? The doctor was expanding the existing office, and they were adding 4 more operatories, right? So the lines that were existing over there were not big enough for the suction. So not only the new lines had to be done properly, the existing lines were not big enough to support the existing compressor. And then what happened was, we were told that they're going to upgrade the compressor. After construction, the equipment person wanted to bring in a second compressor, put it somewhere else. And we're like, well, at this point, it's too late to change the lines going somewhere else. So these are things that need to be looked at and planned for. You can't just go out there and say, I want to do this, but you don't really know what to do. If that's the case, I say hold off until you really know what you want to do before you do it.
Absolutely. These things have to, literally, I think the word that comes to my mind is, it needs to be engineered the right way in order for that equipment in that practice altogether to flow and for it to work.
You gotta trust the process. Engineer it, but definitely trust the process, because some people, most people, I don't like that too. Every one of us is guilty of that, right? When you want to do something, you want to kind of control where you're taking the cost, right? You want to get a feel for the budget while you're doing it. It's hard to explain, but everyone goes through that. Unfortunately, it's just not doable when you're talking about things that there's too many variables, right? Because you can't control it. The only thing you can control, and if you trust the process and you talk to an expert that knows what they're doing, it will work out. It just becomes a trust issue, right? Because the only thing you can say is, look, I only have 60,000. I only have 100,000. I only want to spend 200,000. Whatever the case is, you gotta talk to that expert and figure out how you can get there by putting the issues up there, putting your budget up there, and say, look, solve me this problem. What can you do? But if you go in there and say, I want to build a room. Okay, what if I don't build a room and I build a consult room? Okay, what if I don't do that? Can I make this wall, move it this way? Experts can't help. It's like me going to the doctor and saying, what's wrong with me? I have to tell the doctor what's wrong with me before they start diagnosing it, right? So it doesn't work that way, right? Unfortunately.
Yeah, that's actually a really good example, the doctor example. But yeah, so keep in mind equipment. keep in mind cabinet. That's another remodel area I want to touch on a little bit here. Darwin and I, we visit a lot of offices, and the doctors want to, repaint the floors and refinish cabinets. He's so laughing.
Laminate.
Yeah, tell us about what you've dealt with.
There are some solutions, but there are limited solutions when it comes to cabinetry. And I think sometimes thinking, I have this cabinetry and it's peeling off in this area and I can just quickly replace that. You have color, you have to match it, there's just so much that goes into it that it's just one of those things, kind of like we're talking about adding a chair. Adding a chair could be great because you want the revenue in a chair, but talk about the plumbing, talk about the compressor, talk about the vacuum. That's an investment. You're now digging and touching other pieces of the practice that you didn't even know that you needed to touch. Mm-hmm. Cabinetry is one of those things because it's connected. It's throughout the operatories. It's in sterilization. It's throughout the practice as well, and it's interconnected with countertops. You have to take so much in consideration when it comes to these things. The adhesives. All of that matters to make sure that the installation looks great and most importantly lasts.
Yeah, I mean, relaminating cabinets, I even had one that ended up being cost-effective route to take.
I agree. It's possible, just
possible depending on, I guess, the size and the amount of cabinets.
Yeah.
But it always ends up being you're better off just replacing the cabinetry. Because relaminating it could definitely cost you as well.
Exactly.
People get surprised now because what's involved in relaminating cabinets, pretty labor intensive. So
yeah,
it could definitely cost you.
Cabinetry can quickly take up your budget. That's something that people I want. If you're thinking about painting and flooring and cabinets are going to be the biggest cost between painting, flooring, and cabinets.
You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of everyone is a homeowner. And if you're a homeowner out there and you have hardwood in your beautiful kitchen and living room and something happens to break a plank, and the first thing that comes to your mind is, let me go replace that plank. I can just dig that plank up, take it up in the middle of the room and put another one back in. But if you know anything about flooring, if you know how that beautiful hardwood, it has something called a tongue and groove. And it interlocks. But to change one plank in the middle of the area, you have to do a 5x5, sometimes even more area around it to the walls to make sure that looks. Now, then you get to that point, you have to make sure that the hardwood planks are the same width, the same height, the same everything. They have the same tongue and groove. They have the same bevel, micro bevel, edges, all of that because you want it to make it look flush, beautiful, like nothing happened. Same theory we're talking about here with everything else. One little thing, I just gave you 5, 6, 7 different scenarios on hardwood. Same thing with laminate. You have so many pieces to take into consideration to make one little thing look better.
Yeah, well said. And I guess my last thing I want to touch on, something I just want to say out loud, is generally speaking, it is a much more difficult and time-consuming process for a full remodel and an expansion than it is for a new build-out. Let me explain what I mean by that. When you have an existing office, and you have a 2,000 square foot existing office, and I'm building you a 1,500 square foot office a couple of miles away for you can stay in business. It's much easier for us. We're starting off with a shell, we're building up. When you're expanding an office or you remodel, when I say remodel, I don't mean moving one wall here. I'm talking we're adding operatories, like what we did in Ashburn. That is actually a more difficult and can be more costly process than building a new office. Something to keep in mind. Some people always assume a new office is going to be more expensive. Goes back to what Art said.
Well,
consider the situation.
Well, there's remodels. If you're going deep into remodels and moving walls and stuff, there's a lot of unforeseen costs that can come up, right? Let's talk about that, right? If I demo an existing wall, most of the times we know what's in there, we can tell. But there's sometimes there could be stuff in there I can't tell. Like it's going from downstairs to upstairs. It doesn't even belong to you, so you can't even, let's say there's a pipe going upstairs through that wall. You broke that wall. It's not even your pipe, it's your upstairs neighbor's pipe, right? Or downstairs. What are you gonna do? You can't just cut it, right? So you have to come up with a way to redesign that wall so that that area is covered because it belongs to the building, right? So there is more to speak to what you were talking about. There's more unforeseen costs, not necessarily more costly, but more unforeseen costs that would add to or existing budget that you never thought about?
Going back to that 6 phase, anytime you phase a project, it's much more expensive. Obviously, you said so yourself. You got to build literal temporary walls. You have to take down walls, build temporary walls, take down the temporary walls, build a new wall. But yes, it's more expensive to do the 6 phases. But something that doctor, I'm sure, considered when you dealt with them is what was more expensive to them: shutting down
Exactly. Right.
for 4 months or paying a 6-phase project.
And that's when I get involved, and I always tell clients, that's a calculation you got to sit down and make, and make a good business decision.
What is 4 months worth to you?
You're looking at cost, how much you're going to lose in those 4 months versus peace of mind, how much pain you're going to take within this 4 months. Because understand that even during construction, the best contractor is going to create dust, noise. You're going to be dealing with it, right? And if a phase out project takes 4 months, maybe if you shut it down, you're only shutting down for 2 months, not 4 months, right? So the question comes in: can you, say, okay, I'm just going to shut down for 2 months, break it down, redo it. I need my peace of mind. I don't want to deal with the noise, or the costs are significantly higher because I'll be losing production, a lot of production, and that's going to, increase my chances of staying open. It's just that, right?
So what is 1 day worth to you? Something you gotta, to everyone, whether you're a doctor or not, what is 1 day worth to you? What is your time worth?
And we've done both, and it's a business decision that they have, everyone's gonna have to make if they're in that situation. I do want to talk and switch gears and talk about, just want to get a feel for what you guys think as far as, there's a lot of doctors that buy existing practices, right? When you buy an existing practice, and we always say, people ask me, I always talk about this, they're like, is it better to build an office or build a practice or buy an existing one, right? My answer is it depends, right? I understand the benefit of an existing practice, the fact that it's already got patients, you're building patients, right? But what do you guys think about the actual existing practice, the cosmetic look, the quality?